Khabib Nurmagomedov's dominance in MMA grappling wasn't built on one skill. It was the product of a system that started in childhood and developed into one of the most oppressive styles the sport has ever seen. When people talk about Khabib, they usually mention the smothering pressure, the endless takedowns, and the brutal ground and pound. But those were just the visible parts of a much deeper structure. Khabib grew up in Dagestan under the guidance of his father, Abdulmanap Nurmagomedov, training in wrestling and combat sambo from a very young age. That background produced a grappling style that blended relentless takedowns, positional riding, and striking in ways that most fighters simply weren't prepared for. Once the fight hit the mat, opponents weren't just dealing with grappling, they were dealing with a system designed to exhaust them, break their posture, and remove every path of escape. In this video, we're going to break down what actually made Khabib's grappling so effective. Combat sambo played a central role. Unlike pure wrestling, it combines takedowns, submissions, and striking, which closely mirrors the demands of MMA. That meant Khabib wasn't just learning how to bring opponents to the ground, he was learning how to transition immediately into control, advance position, and apply damage. Training was consistent and structured. Sessions focused heavily on repetition, pressure, and positional work, often against multiple partners and under fatigue. Over time, this produced a style built on efficiency and control, where every movement had a purpose and every position led to the next phase of the system. By the time Khabib entered professional MMA, he wasn't adapting his grappling to the sport. He was applying a system that had already been built for it. This video is brought to you by Iron Jiu-Jitsu Hybrid Combat Shorts. These are available on Amazon Prime, and they've also earned the Amazon's Choice Badge for grappling shorts, based on consistent sales, strong ratings, and customer satisfaction. And if you look at the reviews, it lines up. People consistently mention the comfort of the built-in compression liner, the freedom of movement from the shorter cut, and how well they hold up during hard rounds and even competition. You've got guys using them multiple times a week for BJJ, others competing in them, and coming back to buy more pairs. They're built for real training, grappling, MMA, wrestling, not just for looks. Durable, lightweight, and designed so nothing shifts or gets in your way when things get intense. If you want something you can rely on every session, these are a solid option, and they're available now on Amazon Prime with free 2-day shipping. Khabib's sambo and judo would end up being a fundamental part of his success in MMA. Both these sports rely heavily on foot sweeps and subtle off-balancing of the opponent. When one foot is bearing weight, the other can be moved easily, eliminating one of the legs of the table, so to speak. Although judo and sambo are fought on an open mat, they counterintuitively translate into the domain of wall wrestling very well. This is because many defensive pathways to throws, foot sweeps, trips, etc. involve creating hip separation from your opponent. But when your back becomes pressed against the wall, this becomes mechanically impossible. Once a fighter's back touches the cage, their ability to step and recover balance or create distance with their hips is limited. Forward pressure forces their weight onto one leg. In that moment of compromised base is exactly when foot sweeps and inside trips become available. Khabib was one of the first fighters in the UFC to truly treat wall wrestling as its own unique discipline, and he was definitely black belt level in it. From early in his career, Khabib spent much of his time training on the wall in order to prepare for his eventual UFC career, and he became familiar with the particulars of wrestling against the wall, which is quite different technically from wrestling in the open. The conventional wisdom when it comes to building back up to your feet in MMA tends to be to scoot yourself to the cage wall and use it to begin to climb back up to your feet, keeping your back to it. When opponents employed this technique while facing Khabib, or when he pressed them against the wall, they basically became dummies for him to trip, foot sweep, or throw. Khabib showcased these skills beautifully in his bout against 4-time NAIA All-American wrestler Abel Trujillo, whom he would take down 21 times that night. In the first round, after briefly being taken down and nearly finishing an armbar from guard, Khabib made a statement by reversing the position and committing to near-constant grappling exchanges with Trujillo. You can see how Abel places himself parallel to the wall, both using it as a base of support to build height and to minimize exposure to having his back taken, since only the outside hook is available from this position. You'll see that Khabib is actively driving Trujillo's body into the cage. This makes it so his feet are carrying less weight and are thus easier to manipulate, and it also limits his ability to shift his base in a meaningful way, making it impossible for him to get full hip separation or to recover balance. This provides Khabib with the opportunity to get some big lifts, a strategy he will employ several times throughout the night. Khabib's wall wrestling mastery would again be on display in his bout against Edson Barboza. Watch here in the first round where Khabib has Edson firmly against the wall. Khabib, using an over-under body lock, heavily off-balances Edson onto his right leg. You can see here that his left leg becomes unweighted. It is even lifted into the air. Khabib then proceeds to switch to an inside trip on the unweighted and thus easier to displace, leg, rotating it out from under Edson's base, taking him down directly to his back. Again in the third round, we see an exchange that isn't quite as flashy, but it points to Khabib's keen understanding of weight displacement. Khabib has Edson pressed against the wall with an unlocked double leg. Edson is using the split squat defense, which is quite standard on the wall. The goal is to prevent the attacker from transitioning to a locked double. He is also keeping his feet and legs flush to the wall, with the goal of Khabib from getting an angle or back exposure. You can see Khabib shifting Edson's feet from side to side, trying to get a leg separated from the wall. He then circles to the weight-bearing leg while keeping Edson's hips firmly planted against the wall and manages to just sweep Edson's foot out from underneath him, forcing him onto the ground. Just look again here in his bout with Dustin Poirier. Khabib is driving Dustin's weight into the wall. When Khabib forces Dustin's weight onto the cage and onto the cage side leg, the outside leg becomes unweighted, which makes it easier to move. Khabib simply sweeps it out from underneath him and sits Dustin back down. Another example from an earlier bout against Rafael dos Anjos. RDA is pressed against the cage and thus unable to get hip separation to prevent Khabib from picking him up. Khabib elevates him, and with RDA's legs unweighted, he's able to sweep them out from underneath his base. We also saw Khabib demonstrate high-level skill in regard to scoring takedowns in the open, demonstrated early in his career when he was fighting on open mats or rings. He was particularly successful with single-leg takedowns. Khabib's confidence in his single-leg takedown was high enough that he would often shoot with very little setup, from a great distance, knowing that he would be able to finish the takedown regardless. This pattern continued later into his career, where he would use the same single-leg attack on the likes of Conor, Kamal Shalorus, and Al Iaquinta, to name a few. His main pathways for finishing the single included sweeping the single leg to his inside hip, where he could then set the opponent down to their hip, switching to a double leg, as well as traditional run-the-pipe finishes. And in his UFC career, he would often elevate the single to incorporate his Sambo-style foot sloops. One example of how Khabib would enter in on his single leg is his UFC debut against Kamal Shalorus. Khabib would set up his single leg by first throwing a feint to get Shalorus's hands busy up top and then shoot a head inside single leg. It wasn't a pretty shot by textbook standards, but Khabib managed to finish off the same entry several times that night. We'll see Khabib use the same approach in his first title fight against Al Iaquinta. Khabib pumps his jab out twice before feinting another jab into a sweep single to Al's front leg. Al does a great job of defending this one by turning and doing the running man escape, along with a couple hard punches to Khabib's head. But just 2 seconds later, Khabib has entered on the same shot again. Jab, feint, straight to the single. This time running Al to the wall before stepping under Al's base, elevating the single to the outside, and sweeping his free leg out from underneath him. This is a finish we've seen Khabib's lifelong training partner, Islam Makhachev, use as well in his bout against Renato Moicano. As a principle, if there's a particular technique for which you have 100% confidence in your ability to execute it, you'll fight like hell to create openings for said technique. After literal decades of perfecting his single leg and tens of thousands of repetitions, Khabib essentially knew that if he could get to a leg, it would result in a takedown. So he would often throw caution to the wind, as he famously did in his bout against Conor McGregor, shooting from halfway across the cage and nearly having the takedown stuffed before managing to cut to a double leg and sitting Conor to his butt, transitioning directly into his system of leg Turks, which were a huge part of what made Khabib so dominant on the ground. Once Khabib got his opponents down to the canvas is when the discrepancy in skill level became most apparent, as Khabib would employ a system of riding and ground and pound that would completely stifle the movement and break the spirit of the other fighter. Equal parts technique, weight displacement, and outright meanness. When fighters found themselves under Khabib, they knew they were in for a rough time. Khabib would use a system of leg Turks that made returning to base and climbing back up to a standing position exceedingly difficult for the other fighter. Khabib was an absolute master at using leg Turks to stifle movement. In MMA, the path to your feet generally involves first going to turtle, and then a tripod, and then to standing, often using the wall for balance. But the first movement within this chain is the heist, taking a leg that is in front of you and putting it behind you or underneath you. In its most simple form, Think of a technical stand-up in your intro jiu-jitsu class. The same would be true in half guard, where the fighter on bottom would first need to pull this leg out and put it behind or underneath them to begin to make their way to a base from which they can stand up. Khabib, however, was always using his legs to prevent movement or heisting from his opponents. Instead of favoring positions such as mount or side control that are often treated as forward progress from grappling, but are actually less of a controlling position because they allow the opponent the use of both their legs, Khabib would look for leg turks. Turking the top or bottom leg on an opponent in tandem with wrist rides, or Dagestani handcuffs as they have been monikered, allowed Khabib to use his free hand to strike opponents while they were fully focused on escaping the position. In his bout with Dustin, Khabib employed the same strategy. He sat in a modified mount with a single hook, which served to prevent Dustin from turtling or building to a base. Dustin would begin to use his bottom arm to begin to build height, but Khabib would alternate between harassing that arm to prevent him from building base and face cranking Dustin, disrupting his breathing, looking for chokes, and generally being nasty. Again in the third round, Khabib is in a similar position shortly after almost being guillotined. You'll notice that when Khabib takes the hook, he doesn't just take the hook, but he also consciously places his knee and then later uses his foot to track Dustin's bottom leg and to act as sort of a wedge to stop him from putting that leg into a position in which he could base. At the same time, he is maintaining the Dagestani handcuff with the cage side arm so he can continue striking with his free arm. The dilemma of trying to find your base and recover the use of your arms, all while trying to defend against strikes and submission attempts that are coming from behind you, exhausted Khabib's opponents. Another offensive grappling tool that Khabib uses is his double leg ride, dubbed the mermaid leg wrap thing by Conor McGregor. Standing up from a seated position against the wall once again requires that you take a heisting leg and withdraw it so it is underneath you in a base, so you can then begin to make your way up to your feet while attempting to fend off strikes and submissions. If the fighter on top unlocks their hands to strike while in this position, it generally allows you to escape, even if you eat a punch or two in the process. Khabib was very proficient at doing this double leg wrap from this position, which prevented any leg heisting, and thus opponents were unable to build up to a base and generally had to go belly out and try to rebuild or just stay there and eat strikes. Listen to him explain it here.
He had his back on the fence. I pushed my knee under his knee and swung over with my right leg to close figure 4 and sit down to control him. You don't need to hold him here, just sit down and isolate his legs. He's obviously forced to escape from this position. Once he starts to try to get his legs out, he opens up on my punches. Now he needs to defend his head, and I keep the control because he's nowhere to move. There's the cage wall behind him. The only thing the opponent needs here is to push your knee to escape. If I let him do it, he'll use this chance. So like I said, once he tries to get out, he exposes himself for strikes, and I throw punches to his face. He defends his face, I keep the control.
One notable opponent he used this against was Justin Gaethje. Immediately after finishing the double leg, Khabib starts to work towards the double leg wrap, but instead of holding this position, he uses it to pivot both of Justin's legs towards the cage, thus taking Justin's back from its supported position against the cage and forcing him onto his back, where Khabib is able to work to mount before working to S-mount and nearly finishing an armbar. We'll see a similar sequence again in his bout with Dustin Poirier. Dustin attempts a standing switch, successfully off-balancing Khabib, but he is able to recover and assume the top position anyway, and go to a double leg wrap position. Although this time, he isn't using the figure 4 and is rather just sitting on Dustin's knees. Dustin, who must have studied Khabib's habits from here, doesn't use his hands to push Khabib's knees further down, which is the intuitive movement from here to free his legs, but would be a tactical error because it would then allow Khabib to pull his back off the cage and lay him flat, which is ultimately what Khabib does anyways, finishing the round with some big ground and pound. In his bout with Conor, he used this position as well, again trying to use the double leg wrap to not only stifle movement, but to attempt to rotate Conor's back off the cage, which Conor initially does a good job defending against. Eventually, Khabib is able to use the legs to rotate Conor off the wall and put him in a prone position, but he didn't have much time to work here due to the round ending. And again in round 2, takedown, leg wrap, rotate off the wall, eventually leading us to some heavy ground and pound exchanges. In an MMA context, the fighter on the bottom needs to create space to escape, but this also allows the top fighter the ability to posture and strike. So the bottom fighter will often try to keep the top fighter close to them, pulling them in to prevent them from posturing until they can use one explosive movement to start to build back up to their feet. We'll see here that As Khabib is in Conor's guard, he does a great job of utilizing frames in order to posture and strike. Exhibit A. Conor is using both hands to try to control Khabib's head here. So Khabib swims one frame inside and frames across Conor's chest neck area. This serves to keep Conor from sitting up to close the space and allows Khabib to keep space while landing with his other arm. Now he's framing on the shoulder. Khabib lands, then addresses the frames again, this time taking a bicep frame on Conor's right arm to keep Conor from reaching with that arm to close the space. You'll see he's still favoring the bicep frame here, with the opposite leg out for added height and stability and landing some big shots with his right hand. Thomas Kincaid in MMA has a great in-depth breakdown on ground and pound that's worth checking out for a deeper dive on the topic. Khabib wasn't just a pressure-heavy wrestler either. He had an arsenal of submissions that he could execute pretty frequently, submitting the likes of Conor, Dustin, and even putting Justin Gaethje to sleep with a triangle from S-mount. And to top it all off, he had a gas tank that allowed him to maintain full intensity for an entire fight, with opponents knowing that he had the ability to take them down and smash for the full 15 to 25 minutes if need be. Honestly, we could talk about Khabib's grappling all day, but we'll end our video here for now. Let me know down in the comments anything you noticed about Khabib's grappling that I might have missed and what you'd like to see next. Please consider liking and subscribing to help us grow the channel as well, and check out our sponsors in the description.